So hi everyone. We're the Game Development Student Association, and we have our first guest speaker session with Medeiros, professional board game designer, and he's here to share a lot of his experience with us and answer your questions. So, yay! Cole. Give it up for Cole.
Hello, everyone. So for my presentation today, my plan is just to kind of walk through some slides that I have that mostly summarize my experiences and talk about some of the things that I've worked on, and then hopefully can open it up to a lot of questions, because I'm just curious to hear your questions, and that way I can cater some of the information that I can share to things that you're most interested in. So my name is Cole Medeiros. I just consider myself a game maker, sort of with a bent towards storytelling. That's what really interests me about games and these kinds of experiences. This is my email for work, so if you have questions or follow-up things, feel free to reach out just about anything. I like talking about games. I could talk about it all day, so I'm happy to answer any questions whatsoever. So I currently work with Concerned Ape, supporting the business side so that he can focus on Stardew Valley and now onto Chocolatier. So that's what I'm doing. I wanted to throw this in here. If there's questions that you have, feel free to interrupt. I'm happy to jump onto that. So about anything that I'm about to show you or that we're talking about, or you can save it to the end, whatever is best. I like for these things to be conversations. So yeah. I'm probably forgetting a lot of things like names and details, mainly because I have 2 little kids and they take up most of my brain. But it is fun to be a parent, because now my kids are starting to play board games and video games with me, and I just really enjoy that. I've always loved board games. Always loved all kinds of games, really. One of my earliest memories of seeing like what a board game can really do beyond the more standard ones is Hero Quest, and I just remember thinking, wow, this is the most incredible thing I've ever seen. And it just opened me up to this whole world of interesting mechanics and designs and fun little ways to play with toys on a board, cards and dice. And so in this time, I was probably around, 8, and I started realizing, wow, I can make my own games. And so I began prototyping a lot. And what I liked about it was that with board and card games, it's very accessible. You need some dice, some paper, just kind of like random things that you can find around your house, and you can start making games. And it's very easy to test them and iterate them. Even as a child, I was able to do this with my friends, and it just was like a fascinating new world for me. And one of the things I started thinking about later on is why is it that I like games? And I found this is called I think the Bartle categorization of gamers. And I find this very useful because everyone falls somewhere on this chart in terms of what they're really drawn to. So there's, you have folks that are very competitive, and I think they're considered the killers. They're trying to fight each other and achieve mastery and become the best. You have achievers that are collecting everything and just really value high scores, and they're the ones that are getting all of the achievements. Socializers are getting online, right, to talk to each other or sitting at the table together, and their main focus when they're playing games is just the interaction with their friends. And then the explorers are the ones who want to find out what's over there and what's under here, and how do I mix these potions together. I find myself somewhere between the socializer and explorer, and knowing that, it helps me focus on what kinds of games I want to play and design, what I'm just drawn to naturally. So I think this is very useful as you're making games to think about where you fall on this chart, and also if you're trying to make a game for an audience, where do they fall on this chart? Because it can kind of help guide your decisions. I love that games can be story generators. So there are these systems that are randomly mixed together and an experience pops out. And that's just really neat to me, the idea of being able to replay things, have different experiences each time I play, or play the same game that somebody else is playing, but we have totally different experiences and we can talk about it. That's just really fun for me. Because I really value this shared experience. This is my brother, my dad, and my wife. We were playing D&D, and it was the first time some of them had played, and it was just neat. You know, we have a story, and we get to pretend to be characters, and we dressed up because it was funny. So this was the first game that I made that became something. It's called Gubs. It started as just, you can see on the left, just some index cards sort of cut up and hand-drawn. I self-published it during college, and then after college, GameRight picked it up and published it for about 10 years. And I'm trying to reprint this game, so this is kind of the colors are not as vibrant as they actually are in this picture, but this is sort of the evolution of this game, something I'm working on. This really taught me a lot about like how you make a game, how you test a game, and I would just encourage anybody who's interested in game making to just really try to get their hands dirty, make something, play around with it. That's the best way to learn all of these relevant skills. So I was drawn to graphic design because in order to make card games and board games and also video games, you need some understanding of how to lay out the stuff so that people can understand it. And it needs to be clean and crisp. And so these were the programs that I got familiar with. This led me to doing some graphic design at a company called Smith Micro. I was there for a little while. I got a call from a friend who I worked with in this industry. He had jumped over to Zynga. And then so I came to the Bay Area and started working at Zynga, doing just intro level game design stuff, which was a bit more like content design. So it wasn't until, you know, later that I was designing mechanics and features and building actual games. At the beginning, I was just kind of filling out these games that they had made. So one was Mafia Wars, which I learned a lot about just free to play, this concept of, you know, viral social features, building economies, things like that. And so this was like my crash course into a game as a service and as a business. And Facebook and mobile games were kind of new, so it was like this wild west of just like make these games, put them out, do all this stuff. And it was a very interesting time to be working on stuff like this. And then there were other titles like Castleville and Cityville, which were similar. Mostly as a game designer there, you're doing content and features and events. Less true game design, in my opinion, for the most part. But you know, they're still building games, and the creation of the games obviously includes a lot of game design, and the coming up with the more complex features and things does. But for this type of game, there's a good amount of just content design that has to go in and sort of feed them, and so that there's enough content for players to keep coming back. That was the model of these. I did get an opportunity at Zynga to try and pitch a game, and this was kind of my first brush with how difficult this really is to do, largely because I feel, in my situation at least, there's quite a big divide sometimes between folks who are passionate about games and folks who really understand business. And I think it goes both ways. And so trying to make something that's interesting and compelling for a game designer, but is also profitable for the business. There's a lot of, you know, tug of war that goes back and forth, and a lot of trying to figure out how to find that cross section that works. After Zynga, I went over to a place called Storm 8, and this is when I kind of became aware of there are different approaches to making games, and like Storm 8 was really good at establishing like this tech base that they could apply to a lot of different projects. And so they were founded by engineers, and so they had really this engineering first mindset. And I think that was kind of interesting at the time for me to see this like set of tech that they could just put down as the foundation and then build a game on top, and then use that same tech to build another game. So we were looking at Heyday at the time, and it was like, oh, let's try to do something similar. So we created Farm Story 2, and this was a lot of fun for me because I got to inject a lot of character and story and kind of this world that we built. And this did pretty good. But it was interesting. There was a lesson because we tried to take this game and say, okay, great, we made this farm game that works really well. Let's take the same engine and let's make a restaurant game. But I don't think it did as well. And we really struggled with why is this one struggling, whereas the farm one was doing quite well. And I think a lot of it had to do with theme, and just that the theme of a farm of generating resources and processing them and having animals and all of these things is just much more appealing than doing kind of the same thing but in the restaurant format that we had. And so I think that was just a lesson for me that sometimes the same mechanics with different themes might not work as well. And I mentioned this before, that I really do think the leadership of a company sets the DNA for the company. So it kind of filters down from the top in a way, because Zynga was really good at this like virality and shooting stuff around and sending messages and making games around these social features. Storm 8 was really good from an engineering point of view, technically. So they had a really solid technical basis. Well, then I went over to SGN, which became Jam City. And so what Jam City was good at, I think, was business. They were founded by business guys who could make really good deals. They were acquiring companies and IPs, a lot of promotion, and largely focused, all these companies were focused on making money, but I think that was just part of the DNA of like Jam City. This is what they were trying to do. And when I was working there as a game designer and a lead game designer, my day-to-day was largely pitching games when we were starting projects or helping to develop games, so writing specs and design documents. As I got more senior, I was reviewing a lot more design work, and just trying to bridge the gap between different departments. So making sure the artists understood what the engineers were doing and just everybody's talking to each other. I was building teams, kind of just shepherding the overall design of a game forward, mostly doing it through documents, presentations, and just talking a lot to a lot of people. We also played games and we prototyped. Sometimes we were building physical versions of what we planned to build later digitally, just to try things. And I thought that was really an interesting cross-section of tabletop to digital. Also there, I worked a little bit on games inspired by episodes and choices. So it was starting to be these like choose your own adventure story type games. This is how we were blocking that out. I find this also, it's a bit analog, but I would recommend this if you're ever designing a complicated project. Sometimes it helps to get away from your computer, sit down at a big table, and start sketching down like what are all the components that are going to go into this project. Because you can start grouping things and building this map. And it's, we did this for a couple days to outline an entire game project. And it just helped everybody that was working on it see what we were building, think of all of the things and how they have to be connected. And I have a theory too, that if you put all this down on paper and it's just too much, it like fills up, it overflows your table, you're probably trying to build too much. And so it's kind of a good test for scoping in a way as well. This was some of the trees of the stories. So we learned a lot about writing stories and branching narratives. It's very complicated to do this really well. And ultimately at the time, the input to the output that we would get from the game didn't quite add up. So my game was cut. And this is really common that, studios and groups, it just doesn't work out to make a game. And I almost didn't last at Jam City, but I scooted sideways over to work with the central tech team. which was awesome. I kind of stepped into more of a producer role, and I learned a lot about how does the central tech team maintain this pipeline for all the data that's coming into the company. How is it processed? How is it managed? And how do they support all these different teams? So that's what I was doing. I was kind of running around, learning about that. And even though I wasn't very technical, it was very useful for me to hear things from these very advanced engineers and then go and explain this to game teams who are maybe also not so technical. And I became like this go-between or like a diplomat to make sure the game teams were getting what they need from Central Tech, and that Central Tech was very aware of what the game teams were going through. And it was around this time that I was introduced to Concerned Ape through a mutual friend, actually. I think my mutual friend was thinking, oh, you like board games. Maybe you'll make a board game with him. And so I pitched for about a year the board game, trying to get a prototype that really felt good. And after a year, he said, wow, this really does feel like Stardew Valley. Let's go ahead and do it. And so then he put some money towards it. And a year later, we released the board game. And around that time, he said, hey, I could use some help with all the business side of things. And so I came on officially, mainly to answer emails and talk to people and consider all the new opportunities that were coming in. Because when he sat down to make Stardew Valley, he wasn't really thinking about all of the business stuff that would come should the game be as successful as it was. And so my role is everything that is not game design right now is my job. And then so he can just focus on making the game almost like a creative director. Our team is still very small. We have there's like 5 full-time employees, and most of them are focused on engineering and implementation. But yeah, so I'm the guy that kind of handles everything else in logistics. So I helped set up some of these merchandise things. And right now we have the live orchestra concerts that are happening. We were just at the Greek Theater in LA, and it was just really special and spectacular to see so many fans coming together and really enjoying the game in different ways. And we just feel very honored to be a part of this community. So I'm just going to end with like a little bit of advice and sort of my process for making games. I feel like game making is really about trying to find the fun, like and there's different types of fun. Like I said earlier, some people want to be very competitive. Some people want to just relax. And so you need to know, what type of fun you're looking for. But once you do, it's like, okay, how do we create that experience? What is that experience that I want? And once I'm thinking about that, I'm thinking, okay, let's prototype something as quickly as possible so we can see if this prototype actually delivers on that experience and I can feel it myself. And a lot of times it's just testing and iterating to get there, because very rarely are you going to say, oh, I want to make a game that feels like this, and then just throw something out there and have it land perfectly. You're going to have to slowly walk towards that and find it. And so failure is good. It doesn't feel good, but it's a signal that you're like on the right track towards something interesting. Or not. Maybe you're going down a dead end and you need to totally change course, but you don't know until you're testing and you're iterating on your idea. And trying just to be really aware what feels good or bad to you, and watching other players and try to see what they do. Maybe not so much what they say, but how do they interact with your game? And do they want to play it again? Or do they kind of avoid certain parts of your game or forget about it? These are really good indicators to kind of point towards what is fun and what is working and what is not. It's really difficult, but you have to decide when to scrap stuff and cut stuff off. Or for the board game, we went through, I think, 9 complete iterations of just the mines. And each time I was like, oh, I think I got it. And no, I don't got it. And I had to throw it out. And slowly it got closer and closer to what it ended up being. But it was kind of a painful, frustrating process. But you just have to say, okay, this is not it. Let me think about it and try something different. And it's just a lot of repetition. So this is the advice that I'll end on, and then we can jump to some questions. But I really think if you want to be making games, just try to do it as much as you can. Just simple games, small games, whatever it is that you're passionate about, just try and make stuff. And think about what it is that you really love, because that's a key, I think, to making something very authentic and effective. If you like battling other people, like, why do you like that? And what are you trying to accomplish? Like, it's almost like a psychological journey, and you kind of have to go deep. But then when you find out what it is that you love, then you're more able to share it with other people through whatever you're making, music, art, games, whatever it is. And other people will see that authenticity and it will resonate with them. I really think that is Concerned Ape's whole ethos, that he's just trying to make something that he thinks is really cool and fun, and then it feels very authentic. Try things and fail. Failure is great feedback. Just plan to iterate. Like, when you make something, think of it as, like, I kind of think of my stuff when I make it as like, it's the garbage version. It's the version I'm going to throw away, but I don't worry too much about it. I'm like, oh, let's just get it out there. Okay, it's not perfect, it's fine. And that will lower the pressure. So you're not trying to make this perfect thing when you first start. You're just trying to make it. Oh yeah. This is just a bit of a warning that, there were times in my career where I felt like I got to where I thought I wanted to be, and then I was like, ooh, I don't like this so much. And so, doing game design as a job, there's certain pressures that don't exist when you're making a game not as a job. And so you may find in some of these cases that you arrive somewhere in some role and you think, oh, this is not what I thought it would be, or the stresses are actually kind of diminishing what I loved about it. And so it's important, I think, just in life to keep your passion alive. And for example, right now, most of what I do is answering emails. It's not game design, but it kind of, I enjoy helping this process. And then I also get to make games on the side. And that's kind of something that I really enjoy. Everything is going to take longer than you think. So starting small is really good. It'll allow you to finish things faster and work on your skills. And in the industry, I ran into a lot of people who seemed a little bit cocky and I know how to do this. I'm really good at this. And that's fine. If you're really good, that's great. But if anyone tells you, oh, I just know how to make great games, there's a process you can know, but nobody really knows what's going to be very successful. And so I think some humility is more of a sign of a great game maker. And I just thought this was funny. How to tell when you're a real professional and you're just like, oh, I don't like to do this at all. But I don't know. Maybe it's not very optimistic, but I just thought it was cute. So that's my presentation. And now I'm happy to take any questions.
Yeah, okay. We have a few questions for you in the chat.
Okay.
I don't know if you would just want to read from them or
okay.
Want to ask any in the audience.
Let's see. So for some of our digital games, we are asked to make physical prototypes because they are easy to iterate on. How would you go about making a physical prototype for games that are less suited for one? What would a physical prototype look like for a game like Heyday? This is a good question because I would say that sometimes certain games lend themselves to a physical prototype. Like, there was something about Stardew Valley when I looked at it that I said, I can see the board game. I can see the plots of land, the top-down view, the turn-based nature of it, and the resource. Really, in Stardew, you're making a lot of choices about resources. And this is easy to replicate in a board game format. Let's say you were trying to take something like a side-scrolling platformer. That's a lot harder to replicate because in the video game, there's a lot of dexterity and movement and motion that does not translate well to board games. So I think when you're making a physical prototype, you have to think about what it is you're trying to test. Like, are you testing a trading economy system? Are you testing like some choices that have like, I don't know, strategic implications? And just recognizing which ones work on the table and which ones don't. Like a physical prototype of Heyday, I could see that as almost like a Euro board game with lots of little tracks and cubes and moving timers around, and getting resources back for certain investments. So I could see that kind of working. Now, I don't think it would be very fun necessarily in that format, but maybe you can at least test the flow a little bit. The next question was, once Concerned Ape agreed to make the board game, what was the collaboration process like? How did you decide on what elements to pull from the video game and adapt it to the board game? The collaboration was really cool. At first, I was a bit nervous because when I was talking to him, it's like I'm talking to the creator of this really successful game. He knows it inside and out. And he can be very serious and focused, and sometimes I found it a bit intimidating at first. But now I know that really he's just very thoughtful, so he's kind of just thinking about things. And throughout, he trusted me a lot. He was like, "Hey, you're the board game guy." At least this was the impression I got. Go and cook up some stuff and bring it back to me, and then we'll discuss it. And his feedback was always very specific. So he would kind of say, "Okay, that's cool. That's cool. There's something about this that I don't like. I think it has to do with this mechanic, or I really want to include more items. I just think that would be fun." So it was actually really easy, as complex as the game was. And this is not always not always the case with the IP holder or the person who is in charge of whatever property it is, because sometimes there's a lot of rules and there's a lot of things they like or don't like, or they're not able to communicate to you very clearly what they like or don't like. But that was not the case with him. He was really easy. I think it's because he's done all of the things for Stardew. So he's the engineer, he's the artist, he's the musician, the sound guy, everything. And so he has a very holistic view of this process and was able to communicate it very clearly. Deciding on what elements to pull from the video game, that was tricky. I probably put too much in the board game because I was trying to almost write like a love letter for the fans, and I wanted them to see all their favorite stuff. But for example, one thing that doesn't really exist that much is you're not doing a lot of crafting, you're not cooking. A lot of things are sort of very condensed and simplified, or just reduced down just to small elements. So it was more like iteration, I guess, and trying to shave away the things that didn't really make sense. The most challenging part of taking a well-known IP like Stardew and capturing it as a board game. I think for me, it was figuring out the zoom level was a little tricky. Like, are we just on a farm? Are we just the town? Are we focused on the villagers? What part of the game, how do we capture it without excluding things that are very key? And so that just took a lot of thought and iteration, trying different ideas. Originally, the game was competitive, and I thought, no, I think it needs to be cooperative. You're all working together like an online farm. And then it was just really tricky to get each of the different mechanics right. So to make them feel good and not too much and too cluttered. The next question, as somebody who has worn quite a few hats over your time in the industry, which role has been your favorite, if any, and why? I think I'm really enjoying working with Concerned Ape right now. It's probably my favorite spot because there's such variety, and also the fans are so cool, and the community is just so special. So I also hear a lot from people who say like Stardew Valley has been something really positive in their life and helped them get through very difficult times. And so I feel very honored to be a part of something that it feels like it's literally making the world a bit better, or helping people in a very real way. So I think that's the most rewarding thing, because I think games have the power to do a lot of cool stuff, and I think Stardew is doing that right now. What is your favorite or the most satisfying aspect of making board games? I think for me, the part that's initially the most exciting is when the concept sort of pops in my head and I think, ooh, I want to make an adventure game that uses just one deck of cards, and then trying to brainstorm that. And then there's this, it goes from that high to this low of like, oh, now I have to figure it out and I'm going to fail a lot and it's going to be very difficult to kind of grapple this idea. But then if it comes out the other side where now we're getting closer to something playable, and the very first time that you play a prototype with somebody and they say, wow, can we do it again? That's probably the most rewarding part, because you say, oh, cool, there's something here. They liked it. We're playing it. It's working. That's probably the most rewarding moment in the process, I would say. And I think that's all the questions in the chat. Is there any more in person?
Any questions from the audience? If not, I have a question actually.
Sure.
So something I think is very interesting is the constraints that you work in while designing a board game. And I think there's a Dead by Daylight board game, if you know about that one. If you were to take any popular game and adapt it into a board game, how do you think you would approach that?
So my method usually is like what I did with Stardew. I had played it before a good amount, but then my game playing time got really diminished because of kids. And what I did was I just sat down and I played the game a lot. Like I played it as though I was just studying it and trying to, I was looking at the wiki. I was like writing down lists of, oh, here's all the fish and here's my experience in the mines, and just trying to immerse myself in it until you start feeling like, oh, okay, I'm understanding how this feels and all of the different components. And then you're kind of like digesting that and trying to think, now that I understand the experience, what is the mechanics of a board game that would support this kind of experience? And so, yeah, and again, I think some games just lend themselves more to tabletop experiences than others. But that's my process. And I just sink in, and then I start brainstorming mechanics and testing them, and just seeing how it all fits together. And I go from there.
If you could adapt any game of your choice, how would you do it?
Like which game?
Yeah, and what approach would you take?
Oh, interesting. One that comes to mind right now is, but I think there's already a board game for this. I just haven't played it. Skyrim. I like sort of the open world adventure games, and with that one, it would be one of I do know a little bit about how the actual board game works, but Skyrim for me is, exploring and finding all this stuff and finding all these stories. So you would really have to figure out a system of how do you make these giant deck of cards that sort of key off each other and generate those narratives, create quests, tell stories, send me to random locations, and then allow for like a satisfying progression path. And so I would be sitting here with, probably a big sheet of paper with the map, a bunch of index cards. I would be identifying, okay, these are the decks I think I'm going to need. And I would probably create 5 to 10 of each of those decks just to see how they played together. And so I would just be sitting here rolling dice, testing cards, and trying to find something that works, that builds those stories, because I think that's the key component of that game. So I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, thank you. That's very interesting.
Yes. So I have a quick question about when you were pitching the iterations for the Stardew Valley board game to the creator. What was that moment where you knew for a fact that you sold him on it, and like you knew that you guys were on kind of the same path, the same vision?
So I was building the prototypes in a program called Tabletop Simulator, which is available on Steam. I found it to be a very handy tool for iterating, because I could create a deck of cards, upload it, and then he was in Seattle, I'm in San Francisco, so it was easy to test it. And every month or so, we'd get together and test a version of it. And on a lot of those tests, some of it would work, and then some of it wouldn't. And I could hear him on the line being like, like he would just be kind of frustrated with, he would say, that's this part, it just doesn't work. And I was like, yeah, it's not quite what I want it to be yet. And we went through that over and over again. And about a year in, we played through the game and we beat it. And he was like, this is really amazing. You should be proud of yourself. This feels like Stardew Valley to me, finally. And I was like, whoa. And he said, it's too easy though. We need to make it harder. and which I was like, whoa, I thought, we want to make something a little bit more relaxed. And he felt, and I think he was correct, that as a cooperative experience, if it's easy, you play it once and you go, oh, that was fun, and you don't play it again. But if it's challenging, the ideal on-ramp is the first time you play, you lose. The second time you play, you get a little bit closer. And the third time you play, you barely win. And that's kind of the ideal cooperative game experience. And so he was right. Although there's a lot of people that say, oh, the game is way too hard. But I think sometimes it's just, that's what's fun about it and keeps you coming back, is like, okay, I want to figure out where are we going wrong in this cooperative experience so we can actually beat the game.
Thank you.
Awesome.
I'm a little bit sick, so I'm just gonna type it in chat because my voice is not great.
Okay.
So
Let's see. At what point do you start play testing when creating a board game? Right at the beginning as individual elements, once it becomes a bit more of a cohesive system? I typically try to make what's called like a vertical slice, where I have a little bit of everything so I can see how it all meshes together. So, for example, if my board game has 3 decks of cards, I'm like, well, what's the smallest amount of cards I can make that can populate those decks and I can play just for a minute or two? And I try to make those as quickly as possible. I think if you're testing individual mechanics, that could work if, like, let's say you have this mechanic that's very core to the game and it's kind of big and complicated. Maybe you would build that first and test that and make sure it's working, and then kind of like create these other systems alongside. But I don't know. I've always kind of done it holistically, where I need at least a little bit of everything, because, a board game is different than a computer game, because like a board game, you're using your brain to kind of process and run everything, whereas a computer is like doing that in the background. So I sort of need to see like the whole picture and make sure as a player, like, I can manage it all. So that's just my approach, but I imagine there's different approaches too.
thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Anyone else?
Oh, we have another question. Yeah.
Okay. When creating tabletop games, how often do you find yourself creating fully unique deck sets / randomization systems as opposed to using a standard suited deck or polyhedral dice? It really depends on what I'm going for. Like, I think usually I'm using, like, it's almost like I have a set of mechanics that I think of as tools, many of which are drawn from games that I've played and seen. And I try to just go with whatever is the simplest thing that accomplishes the goal. Like if I want a system where it's like, okay, there's a 1 in 10 chance to hit this monster, okay, you're rolling a 10-sided dice. Or maybe you're baking that into the cards somehow so that the player is not really thinking about probability. They're just drawing a card and seeing what happens. But those probabilities are in that deck of cards. And so if the game seems to call for something really unique, I'll seek that out. Or maybe just this unique idea pops into my head and it's like, oh, I've never seen that before. That's kind of a cool mechanic. Maybe I can build something around that and it thematically inspires something else. So it's kind of chicken and egg, I guess, a little bit. But that's how my brain works.
Oh, great. Yeah, that's a really good question. If you don't mind, I have a question regarding game design in just board games. So
Okay.
specifically, in digital games, you have like that one mechanic that that games typically latch onto to make the entire game. What would you say the equivalence to that in board games would be? That one specific mechanic.
I don't know if there's necessarily one mechanic. I feel like a lot of board games that I see, it seems like somebody came up with some clever system and then they expanded around it. Like I haven't played the game, but I've heard it's really good. There's a game called Isle of Cats, and it's like what it looks like to me is almost like this Tetris-y shapes of cats that you're fitting onto your boat that I think you're transporting or something. And so to me, it seems like someone said, cool, let's make a game where I'm plugging in, there's even a word for it, I can't quite remember, but these shapes and trying to maximize what I can fit in here. And then the rest of the game kind of keys off of that, whether it's the color of the shapes or how big they are or trying to make certain patterns. And so whatever that central mechanic is, I think the rest of the game sort of iterates out from that.
Okay. With that in mind, how would you describe a quote unquote perfect board game? What is the ideal board game? What experience do you get out of that?
That varies because so for me, the success of a thing is really about what is the intention of the thing and how close do you land towards that intention. Because I have a game, it's called Left, Center, Right. It is the simplest little dice game that you could imagine, but people have a lot of fun playing it, even though there's almost zero strategy. And I also have games that take, 6 hours to play and an enormous table. And these are very different experiences. So I think the perfect board game or any, perfect tabletop game is one that has nothing in the game pulls away from that central experience. I'm never going like, oh, this game is really fun, but I hate this mechanic over here where I have to trade resources. Like everything supports the core. I played a really interesting game called Kelp not that long ago, and the concept is really cool. One player is an octopus sort of hiding, the other player is a shark hunting them. And I thought so much about the game was really, really well done, but there was one thing where it's like you're rolling dice as the shark, first you're drawing dice from a bag, and the color of dice determine the actions. Then you're rolling those dice and plugging those numbers in to doing certain things. And something about it, I was like, this is like one level too complex. Like, I'm not getting any joy out of this extra level of complexity. And so I think to improve that experience, I would have just flattened it. I would have like taken out one level of those choices because it just didn't add enough. Overall, I wanted to be a shark hunting the octopus. I didn't really want to do like math over here to optimize that, you know. So that was just an example of, had they maybe just condensed that down a bit, I think the game would have improved and be more just interesting. But
Okay, so you think that the smaller scope stuff can work better, maybe?
I think if you are just really trying to, like, doing something that's really simple and effective is actually really hard to do, because, you know, it's easy to make this kind of sprawling experience with all these different things, and sometimes that's fun. Sometimes that's what the player shows up for. They want complexity and lots of choice and to crunch through all these numbers. Like, think, you know, there's a game called Advanced Squad Leader that is like famous for being just really crunchy and lots of details, but the people that play it love it because they're just like, oh, this is cool. I get to manage all this stuff. But my friends who don't want to dig through that rule book, they want something they just put on the table. It's very intuitive. They learn it. We play. Maybe it's 20 minutes, and that's their ideal experience. So there's like different levels, and different perfect experiences for those different levels, if that makes sense. I have this one game. I think it's incredible, but it's almost completely inaccessible to most people. It's called Magic Realm, and it took me about 10 years to learn how to play this game. It's just because it's so weird and strange. And even now I know how to play it, I don't know how to play it well. But I still keep coming back to it because I find it so fascinating. So it's just different experiences for different people, I guess.
That is so interesting and a really good answer.
Thank you.
We have another question in the chat.
How do you balance being original but still keeping a game familiar so players don't feel lost or getting disinterested when creating a game? That's a good question. I don't think... I think sometimes really striving for originality is a bit of a trap. I think if you try to like zero in on the experience you really love and try to make that, and you just try to stay true to yourself and your own preferences, what you think is really good, you will naturally make something original because you are unique and original. So your combination of things you love will surface in that game. And I've also heard people, they're trying to make something and they're like, oh, I'm trying to do this thing just because no one's ever done it. And I look at their project and I'm like, this is not really fun, not interesting. Nobody's done this because it's just not a good idea. So, you know, striving for originality for its own sake, I think is a distraction. I think it's better to make something following your gut of what you find to be interesting. And if it's too familiar, it might mean that the thing already exists. And so like I wouldn't go make Yahtzee because Yahtzee exists, but maybe I have an idea to sort of tweak that mechanic and do something interesting with it. That's fine. I just say, oh, it's like Yahtzee, but it does these other things. And I don't think people will mind. They won't mind as long as it's fun and interesting.
Really, really good answer. Well, this one's a little more specific, but an assignment that the first years here in the program get given very early on is creating a board game digitally, and they have about a month to do it. Do you have any like tips, advice, or any takeaways given that time period and being completely new to like game engines and stuff that you think would be helpful for them?
Yes. I mean, I think the obvious answer is just trying to keep the scope way down, like try to create something that's relatively simple. I've often thought about trying to make a board game digitally. Like I'm familiar with Tabletop Simulator, but I thought, oh, it'd be really neat if I could create an engine where I can populate it with cards and decks and draw things and kind of create my own engine to make games that way. But I find it very daunting, actually, because I'm not a programmer, and just making that leap from a spreadsheet to a digital game. I think following a lot of tutorials, if possible, just to become familiar with whatever engine that you're working with, because a lot of this stuff has been done before. So if you can, follow along, or sometimes I've gone on to Chat GPT, and I'm like, hey, I'm trying to do this. Do you have any references you can point me to? And sometimes I kind of use it like a search engine sometimes, and then I'm finding tutorials and YouTube videos and documents that I can go through. And but starting small is just probably the best thing to do, because everything is going to get more complicated than you think. And if you're unfamiliar with it, just trying to set yourself up for success is important.
How small exactly do you think? If you could give an example, maybe off top of your head, pitch a board game that would be made within a month. How do you think you would do that?
Like if I was working on it, I would try to do something where there's a board with pieces that I can move around, and their location on the board has some sort of effect, whether it's I'm moving down a track, or maybe there's places where pieces that I'm placing that have certain meaning, or setting certain variables, and then like a deck of cards and maybe a dice mechanic. But if I could get away with not having that, maybe not even that. And because I ran a Kickstarter for a game called Web of Spies years ago that I made, and the game was just a board, a deck of cards, some dice, and some pawns. And there was a lot of complexity you can get out of that, but it's about as basic as you can be. So that's my thought on that.
Really, really good advice. We have another question in the chat.
Let's see. Where do you see the future of board games? Those coffee, dessert cafes, meetups where board games seem to be popular, and the overall industry as a whole going forward. What trends do you see being incorporated into board games? There's a lot more board games that seem to be like Kickstarter and GameFound kind of have been chroming out these games where they're adding all these deluxe bits, and there's tons of miniatures. So I think there's some kind of like inflation of some of those projects. I'm also seeing more like legacy stuff, or games that are intended to be played over campaigns, or even things where you're putting stickers or destroying cards, which I find a bit interesting. In terms of where it's all headed, I mean, there's also things like they're incorporating more digital stuff. So there's like an app assistant, which I personally don't like that much, because I really like the idea of I can take a board game into the forest and put it on a table, and I don't need anything else. I can just sit there and play it, and I don't need to refer to an app that might not be updated in a couple years. Or so I'm a little bit more I like just the paper side of it. But I don't know, in terms of where it's going, I feel like it has exploded. Like there are so many games right now, board games, that the industry is a bit like overflowing, and it'll probably shrink down a bit more soon, because there's just not enough people to play all these games. That's just some of my random thoughts on that.
That's really interesting. On that topic, I would, you generally think board games are more of a niche type of I guess they're more categorized as a niche thing, and your average person isn't really on par with a board game.
Mhm.
How do you deal with dealing with such a niche, I guess, audience?
Mm. Yes. Well, it's interesting because Board Game Geek is probably the biggest board game focused website, and I used to give it a lot of clout, but I've sort of realized that site represents the connoisseurs, the people who like are really devoted and they're playing lots of games, and they're criticizing the thickness of your card if it's like one little bit thinner, and so those opinions don't really represent the massive amount of people that are playing games and not posting about it online and not talking about it. So I don't know, just like trying to have a conversation. I still think it comes down to like, what do my friends like to play? What do I like to play? What are the conversations we're having or the games that I'm seeing people playing? I don't know. I feel like I got a little off track on this question, but it's just some thoughts about like interacting with the audience and talking about it.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, so we have a few minutes left. I think for the end, I would really love if you had any brand takeaways you'd love to leave us off on. Anything really important you think when it comes to creating, designing board games, or anything about the industry in general.
Yeah, I think games have a lot of unrealized potential. I think they can serve as therapy. I think they can serve as educational. Like there's kind of a, in the past at least, people would kind of roll their eyes like, oh, educational games are kind of terrible. But imagine if you wanted to learn something really complicated, like how does the government work, or how does the economy work, or how do scientists put stuff into space? Like these are all things that could be represented as games, and I think would be so fascinating and compelling. Imagine a game where you're trying to invent a cure for some kind of disease, and it's really mirroring the reality of it. How many scientists and professionals could come out of these kinds of experiences? They can also generate a lot of empathy. Like imagine a game that represents crises that are going on in the world, or resource shortages and struggles. And it isn't really until you sit down and you try to handle it yourself that you go, wow, this is really difficult and I don't know the answers, but I have ideas. I think game makers could lean into that more and become like a really powerful just vehicle for change in the world and making the world better. There's a really interesting talk. It was like a TED talk done by this guy who, you should look it up. It's called the World Peace Game, I think. And what he did is he built this multi-layered board and put all these risk pieces on it. And he divided his classroom of like fourth graders, I think, into countries. And he said, okay, your country has a water shortage. Your country is about to go to war. And he made these kids like play a game, and then they would come back the next day and he would say, oh, this is what happened as a result of your choices. And he would move the board around. And it was like the most fascinating thing I've ever seen. And so I think that kind of stuff is worth considering. It's beyond just entertainment. Entertainment is important, but I think there's a lot more. So I hope to be able to build games like that. And I hope that some of your games also, have that capacity.
Fantastic. Really good stuff. Well, as we reach the end of this, oh, sorry, we have one more question to end it off.
Sure, of course.
So this might be a little vague, but what advice would you give for new devs that might be going to industry now? Like what would it be? And then something along the same lines where like you had advice on people getting into specifically the design element and roles that they should work up to, and any advice on potentially getting hired as a young developer getting fresh out of school.
Yes. So I'm a little bit out of the job hunting scene. So I think my advice is a little bit rusty, but I've been talking to a lot of people about that lately, at different levels and at different, focuses, like engineers and designers and all kinds of things. And my advice really would be, so there are opportunities, but they're sort of buried under this layer of automation, of this weird world we live in now where it's just hard to connect with the real person and find these opportunities. And so my advice is actually go onto networks like such as LinkedIn, find companies and individuals that you're like, ooh, I'm interested in what they're doing. And then come up with some questions that are, kind of mid-level advanced, like not questions that you could just Google and get the answer for, but questions that only a professional in that industry doing it day to day could answer. And then send them a message and say, hey, I'm just trying to find out more information about this. Would you be open to a 15-minute phone call with me, or getting onto, a call like this? I would just love to talk to you if that's possible. And see if they can't also connect you, if you do get on a call with them, with other people that they know or other opportunities they're about. You shouldn't go and just say, hey, I need a job. Can you give me a job? Because they're going to say, hey, I can't really do anything. I'm not in that department. But they may, if you get to know them and you start networking this way, they may know opportunities, or they might know companies that are starting or things that are not posted. And if I was getting a job today, I would basically make a spreadsheet with like 1,000 spaces in it and say, I'm going to fill each of these lines with people that I'm going to talk to. Because I did that in the past, actually. I was interviewing people for a project I was working on. It was just a personal project. I was writing a book. And I just interviewed all these people, all these strangers, and they connected me to other strangers. And after a while, I did get opportunities and jobs out of just these random connections that I had made. So that would be my advice for just breaking through this wall that kind of exists right now.
That's some really good advice. Thank you very much.
No, you're very welcome.
Yeah, so as our session comes to an end, thank you so much, Cole, for your time and your answers.
Absolutely.
Super educational. Everyone want to give him a round of applause.
Thank you.